who's nodding away here from time to time, Professor Craig Mahoney, who's Chief Executive of the Higher Education Academy, an organisation which plays very much an intermediary role between providers and organisations and government. So, welcome, Craig.
Thank you very much. This is proving to be a very interesting morning for me so far. I've been delighted to hear some of the discussions that have gone on, and I hope that I can add usefully to that. I've been asked to present on the outlook for higher education, understanding and responding to upcoming challenges. And I think if I'd listened to the four speakers so far this morning before I prepared this presentation, I'd have done something different. So I won't necessarily follow the content as closely as I might have done, but hopefully we'll add to the comments and reflections that have been made up until this point, which I think have been very useful. Let me start by saying that, and I'm talking specifically here about higher education. Higher education in the UK is, as has been said already, an outstanding example of success. And I would not want us to be assuming from some of my comments here that I'm criticising higher education, because I'm not. I think higher education in the UK, across the UK, not just England, is an example of good practice, excellent teaching, outstanding research, and in many cases an outstanding student learning experience. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it is outstanding. But there are some challenges, both inherent in the system right now, and others which are over the horizon and coming at us pretty quickly. It's important for me also to highlight to you that I represent the Higher Education Academy, which is an organisation which works across the four nations of the UK. And so while I appreciate that most of the audience is very English, is focused on the English education system at different levels, my responsibility lies across the UK. And I know there are people here today from the other three home nations and in fact beyond that. But I will reference, therefore, things in a very specific way. So when the previous speaker refers to the white paper, unfortunately so and often done, it's not the only white paper in higher education in the UK at the moment. The Scottish Government also has a white paper for higher education. So I will always preface what I'm talking about with the nation it refers to, if that's not unacceptable to you. As you can probably tell, I come from slightly further south than London, but I've lived in the UK for 26 years, so I believe I have an appreciation for and understanding of and an interest in higher education, which is where I've mainly exclusively worked for that period of time. And I have worked in a number of home nations, mainly in universities, but now in a university body. This is, for me, the most creative time in higher education that I've seen in that 26 years. And as I reference here, I believe the most turbulent time for higher education, either for decades and or centuries. But that provides opportunity, and it's an opportunity which we cannot let pass by without making sure that we enliven the system, create a fit-for-purpose system, and respond to the challenges and needs of both the economy, which has broadly funded higher education up until now, and the students who are coming through that system. As many of you will know, there are 2.5 million students studying in UK higher education in either universities, colleges, or other organisations delivering higher education, a comment related to a question asked most recently of the last speaker. In England, where there's been a significant fee regime, it's created an unintended consequence for the other three home nations, some of which we will see play out in the coming years, most likely in an unfortunate way, and the most at risk at the moment is the Welsh system. And that's because of the government policy in Wales, which indicates students will not pay more than 3465 next year, regardless of where they study, if they're a domiciled Welsh student. And that means the government will therefore pay the difference. And the reason that's problematic is because David Wilkes' introduction of the AAB policy makes Welsh student certificates, when they finish their A-level this year, very attractive to English universities who will take them in number, any number that can come. So a Welsh student who might have previously seen Aberystwyth or Bangor or another university in Wales as their preferred institution can now waive their A-level certificate at an English university who will snap them up straight away because they'll be fully funded, they're outside the number control system, and they therefore become very attractive. That caused a debt problem to the Welsh government, which they didn't expect. That's just one example. Of course, in Scotland we have a different dilemma. The government is continuing to want to fund students at source, and as the previous speaker referred to as well, the debt book, the student loan book, had not been thought through when the English government put in this policy for £9,000 fees and paying it through student loans, because it means it almost triples immediately their debt requirement, which was previously much lower. And if you look at the cost of higher education, sorry, I'm ranting a bit. If you look at the cost of higher education delivery prior to this introduction, it was about £15 billion per year. That's a lot of money for you and I in our pocket. But then you heard earlier today Barry talking about the high-speed rail link. It's going to cost £30 billion. And lots of other initiatives the government deliver are very high numbers. £15 billion is perhaps a modest number by comparison when we think about the benefit that can be gained from that. But the benefit is based on a number of different factors. Those of you that read the Telegraph, great story on the front page this morning about statins. I just started taking them for my high cholesterol. But last week in the Telegraph, there was a story published by some research done by Universitas 21, which is an international organisation of universities, which identified the UK higher education system was now ranked number 10 in the world. Right, it had previously been ranked 2 or 3. US still sits number 1. Now the UK produces the second most prolific amount of quality research of any country in the world, behind the US, but some distance behind the US, and we wouldn't expect to catch the US, a country more than 5 times bigger than the UK, with a lot more universities and a lot more funded research being done. But the research at the UK university sits number 2. The university system sits well down. Now, why does it sit so well down? And it's partly based on the investment by governments of the gross domestic product into the higher education system. And the UK's, by comparison internationally, is extremely low, and of course, as we know in England, going down. That places at risk enormously the value perceived by people of higher education delivered in the UK. And that's probably more relevant to something I want to talk about later, which is internationalisation, but it's probably also relevant to how the system works in the UK as well. We've seen a huge increase in entrance to universities over the past 25 plus years, but most prolifically over the past 10 years, where the previous Labor government was interested in getting 50% of under 30-year-olds engaging with universities. And as we heard presented earlier, that figure sits at around about 43% at the moment of under 30s engaged with universities. It doesn't mean they do a degree, it doesn't mean they complete a degree, it does mean they do engage with university education in some way, or level 4 plus in England and Wales qualifications. Now, the question has to be asked with unemployment figures, which I know were released yesterday, so I'm slightly wrong, but they were last month around 2.4 million, of which 1.2 million were people under 24 years of age, and of which there were a large number of people with graduate qualifications. The question has to be asked, have we expanded the system beyond its capability? So I was really pleased to hear this morning the presentations relating to the modern apprenticeship scheme, which as all of us know is really the old apprenticeship scheme, just with a new name. And as we saw on one of the slides, it's been around in the UK for centuries. It's a great system. So we've got to ask ourselves, what are the skill needs that we have for young people, any people really, in terms of their educational requirements? And while I work in university education, I'm wholly committed to university education. It is not the only pathway into employment. And we need to become much more discerning understanders and users of what education is for, how it relates to a person's development, and where it sits, or perhaps doesn't sit, in terms of their employment and their route pathway into employment. There's been presumptions in the past that university education is about getting a job. Others have seen it as a life-advancing opportunity in which they broaden their skills, gain a whole range of transferable skills, more commonly now referred to as graduate attributes. And they're the right terms to be using. University education is not merely about getting a job, but clearly, in England next year, if a student is burgeoning in debt of £9,000 per year over a 3-year degree program, and of course some degrees are more than 3 years if you're doing medicine, for example, then you're going to have a fair bit of a mortgage by the time you've finished, in which probably your return on investment is based on the likelihood of getting a job. Now, the figures that have been presented so far, and it's all speculative, is that students doing a 3-year degree from next year, from this September, creating that debt of £9,000 toward tuition plus living costs and accommodation, are likely to leave them with a debt between £50,000 and £60,000 at the end of 3 years. That's a pretty big number. Perceptually, it's an even bigger number. And for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, that sometimes can be quite frightening. That's more money than they would ever have heard of, yet it's a debt they might have at the point they leave universities. So the responsibility of universities, therefore, is to make sure that we're doing everything as well as we can. Outstanding teaching, stunning facilities, broadening the skills and abilities of students going going through the systems that meet their needs and the needs of employers or where they see their next opportunity arising. And if we don't do that, perhaps we won't survive. Widening participation has been a strong theme of the university system in recent years, and we heard touched on the presentation just before coffee, of where perhaps it hasn't done as well as we might have thought it had done. There are some great examples of where widening participation has been most effective. In fact, Northern Ireland, of the four home nations, and I appreciate it's a small higher education system, but it has the best widening participation figures of any part of the UK, albeit the numbers are much smaller, of course. But widening participation has worked. Has it worked as well as it could have done? Possibly not. Is it getting where we want it to get to? I'm unsure, but I'll come back to that theme. It remains a constant objective of universities to try and widen participation. And I know, we saw the data before coffee suggesting universities need to be more accountable. I couldn't agree with you more. I find it unbelievable that one of the leading universities in this country, for example, admitted 18 black students the year before last out of its total first-year cohort. Figures and facts of that sort, and you can stratify the data in different ways, are astonishing, unbelievably astonishing, but the problems are endemic, in my opinion. There are 143 universities in the UK, and there are additional numbers of institutions delivering HE. But if we ask people to name the universities that they see as being the most prestigious, they will name Oxford and Cambridge, Imperial and UCL, and some of the other higher ranks, however we choose to rank, Russell Group universities. And that's a problem because employers also have that misplaced perception of what is right and proper. And just referring to my point a moment ago, it's important to identify for students where their education lay, where they should proceed, what they should do. And it shouldn't merely be, I need to go to Oxford and Cambridge, because if I go there, the door's open. Unfortunately, that is true, the door's open if you go to Oxford and Cambridge. Just look at the cabinet in the current government, look at the cabinet in the Labor government previously. Isn't it curious to see that many of them went to the same colleges at the same universities and have been friends for life? There are door-opening opportunities. I don't think that's right, but we can't change it with the education system alone. It's got to be with employer engagement as well. Employers need to be informed of the importance that getting a degree from the University of Poppleton, for those of you not aware, that's a fictitious university referred to on the back pages of the trade press in higher education, used as a satire for taking the mickey out of universities. But the University of Poppleton produces fantastic graduates in underwater macrame. But they won't get a job if they're up against somebody who went to Cambridge doing that same degree. Because there is a perceptual barrier in many employers that says Cambridge has got to be better than Poppleton. But I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. But that is part of a class-based problem that exists between the university system, the culture generally, and employers. We need you, and I know you're probably quite impassioned about this, to keep pressing the buttons of change to make a difference here. And it's not something which, in my opinion, is solvable overnight. You're all familiar with AIM Higher. I won't spend much time on this, but it's interesting that while the government removed the funding for AIM Higher, and lots of fantastic achievements here, most of us would agree, and the government is now beginning to see, that AIM Higher probably hadn't finished its business and could have been continued longer to achieve more outcomes from that. With the defunding of Foundation Degree Forward, as we heard mentioned earlier, my organisation, the Higher Education Academy, has been asked by the English Funding Council to take on some of the legacy responsibilities for that. So I merely highlight here that we do host an archive of the documents. They're still freely available, but at this moment in time, they're not being developed further, so it will become a stagnant resource fairly quickly. But please do make use of that if you want to. I don't know whether these slides are available. The links on here are freely available, but you can certainly have a copy of my slides if that's useful. I would have built more around this if I'd thought more about how the previous speakers were going to speak today, but widening participation isn't merely about bringing on part-time students or postgraduate students, but it's also, as we heard mentioned earlier, about those perhaps who have difficulties in learning, those who are mature entrants to higher education, those who we want to, as part of the system, engage with over the lifelong experience of their life. And some universities are very, very good at this. Some universities are dismissive of it. certainly it's fair to say that all universities have an interest in maintaining an alumnus relationship, but mainly for the benefit of trying to recruit endowments from them rather than necessarily having an engagement with them about continuing learning, continuing to be part of that community. That's a stereotypical comment, unfair, but there is some reality to it. I mentioned the AAB process, and as we've just recently heard, that's now been added to for the following year, to 2012-13, so that it will become in England an ABB process. So any A2B student can waive their certificate in England, and a student at the university can take them as an uncapped number. I mentioned Michael Gove's focus here on A-level reforms. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And this was perhaps touched on a little bit by the previous speaker as well. I find it surprising in a country, both in terms of population and also geography, that we have multiple assessment boards at the pre-university process for normal continuing students. The multitude of A-level or equivalent bodies in this country, I find astonishing. I've become more involved in it recently because of my organisation. And it relates to the question which was asked a moment ago. Pearsons, I know Pearsons are represented here today. Pearsons are involved in this process. They have aspirations to become a degree awarding body at some stage in the future, and why not? They provide huge amounts of curriculum into the university system. So the expansion of the university system under Willis's vision, with what he originally phrased and referred to as a London external type model, it has some merit but huge complexities, and it's not as simple as simply saying you accredit a degree, it can be taught anywhere, and students merely get examined by a group within universities. This A-level process, which is the feeder chain to universities mainly, needs considerable review. I'm not someone who shares the opinion that we've seen a diminution in quality over many years, though you went through the system and you may be able to judge that more effectively. We've certainly seen an increasing number of students coming through A-levels, and an increasing number of students going on to universities. So therefore the thresholds of acceptability may have moved, but I find it fairly difficult to understand how we have a parity of a system here when there are huge numbers of A-level bodies. And one thing I need to say before I pass the slide as well is I vehemently oppose Michael Gove's opinion. Are we going out live on this one or not? Sometimes go too far, but I vehemently oppose Michael Gove's position that the A-level curricula in England and Wales should be written by Russell Group universities. I believe that misses the point of what universities are about, and the belief that the Russell Group is the right group of institutions to do and be involved in that is unbelievably inappropriate. There are outstanding academics across the university system. The Russell Group holds a number of those, I don't deny that, and you could not write an A-level process that excluded the Russell Group of universities. I accept that. But for them to have the preserve of being the group that should do this, I just believe is huge in this case. Clearly, one of the measures of impact in universities is the employability data, and I'll mention it again in just a moment. But if we look at some of the CBI figures here, I know these have been reviewed in the past couple of days. Gross domestic product is very low. The growth in the UK economy is low. We're now in a double-dip recession process. There are huge complexities. In fact, the 2.4 million people unemployed at the moment. There are lots of questions that are being asked by people. There was a YouGov survey done last year in England, which looked at the possibility of an introduction prior to being announced of a £9,000 fee per year. And what people on the street responded to in that survey was that if that were the case, the most significant factor they would expect to see change in universities would be the quality of teaching. Now, in a postgraduate survey that you see here that we run, one of the things that students referred to in that survey in 2011 was that I'm interested in how what I'm doing here relates to my potential employability. So I think the quality of teaching, the prospect of an employment opportunity beyond degrees is becoming a sharp focus for students through university, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate. Yet universities often don't respond positively to that. I know Derby's represented here. Derby, Hertfordshire and Plymouth are probably the three leading universities in this country at the moment who take employability very seriously, embedding it from the top of their institution through their VC, through everything that they do. It's incredibly important to do that, but it's not happening systematically. I'll skip over this slide. We're involved in a lot of employability projects. There's a link there. If you go onto our website, you'll see lots of pilot projects that we're running with different universities that we're partly funding in employability projects, bringing together the closer relationship between the curriculum and the employer, something which has not been done well over many decades, but is becoming more important. But the question's got to be, how do we judge the effectiveness of university education, or higher education, sorry, I shouldn't say university education, higher education in the UK? And one is that we want return users, so that if somebody does experience higher education, they find it valuable and they want to continue experiencing higher education in many forms. Now, the systems in the UK haven't changed in relation to the needs of the students going to them, in my opinion. And let me just cite some examples here of why I'm saying this and what I mean by this. There are very robust systems in universities where the typical model has been that a student would come to university, enter the door at point A, spend 3 years studying, typically 3 years studying, and then exit the door at point B with a degree. That's a typical model of the university system in the UK. What should happen, and what can happen but is often resisted by internal quality assurance processes, well, that's the red tape, as was asked the question before, that's the red tape that universities put in place here, is that students should be able to come in and chunk their learning, do a bit now, do a bit later, do a bit in a few years' time when they're ready. There is a concern, of course, in doing that does the knowledge remain contemporary? Is the purpose of the degree that they were getting still the same degree at the point of exit if it were to take, say, 10 years to do that? That's a fair question, but it can be ameliorated. But in addition to that, in 2000, in the year 2000, the UK government committed to a process called Bologna, that many of you have heard of, I'm sure. And the Bologna process was meant to create a higher education system across Europe, for which the UK is part of Europe, so that students could chunk their studying and do some credit here, perhaps at the University of Derby, go to Cambridge for a second semester, pop over to Paris for a third semester, go to Germany for a fourth semester. That was the purpose of the Bologna process. And the UK government agreed in 2000, yes, we want to be part of this, and the compliance date was 2010. Now, if you look at universities across the UK, you've heard me say there's 143. The number of universities that are Bologna compliant is actually not very high. They've basically ignored a government directive and a European Commission objective of creating that single European higher education system. It's unfortunate because continental Europe has actually bought into it very well. And if I refer back to the comment that Barry made this morning of his unfortunate tweet the other day, when he was having a concerned comment in his dialogue with us, if you recall, that he felt the influx of continental Europeans into the UK was a problem. I don't share that opinion. My opinion will be, why are we not seeing more British people going into the other parts of Europe where they have an equal entitlement to go and find employment for doing that? And the answer is obvious. One is language, and the second is finance. The third is sometimes existing relationships and personal circumstances. But they're no different for the continental Europeans coming in here. And I'm saying that because there's a program called Erasmus that's been operating in the university system for years. You heard me say before, 2.5 million students, 2.5 million students in UK higher education system, 15,000 of those every year go and spend a semester in continental European universities. 15,000 out of 2.5 million. There's 250,000 French students, 250,000 German students who make use of that program every year. We are not helping our students in higher education become employable if we can't help them gain a variety of experiences in employment. The data is very clear. If students spend the time either doing a sandwich course or a work placement or an internship with an employer, they're more likely to be employed at the end of their degree than if they don't. The same is the case with building international experiences. HE can be far more effective. I mentioned the teaching bit. Competing internationally, the UK is a huge higher education industry. Generates a huge amount of wealth, as you see on the slide here, both inside the UK and across the world. There's 430,000 students inside the UK who come from nations other than the British Isles. And there's 500,000 students now, it's just over that, being taught on UK programs in other countries outside of the UK. This is a big, big industry. We need to develop it further. I mentioned that, this stuff here, you can have a copy of this. Finally, one of the things that we're trying to do in the Higher Education Academy with the support of higher education is influence policy and change. And we do that by building evidence, as you heard earlier is important, by building evidence and then trying to position ourselves with ministers and funding bodies, because they hold control across the UK as well, in seeing higher education develop. I'm absolutely convinced that if UK higher education continues to deliver its model in the way it has done for the past few centuries, which unfortunately is not unlike what I'm doing this morning, a didactic model of delivery, where I'm standing in front of you as a group of students and you believe that I have something important to say, we will die. We will die. This is not the way to deliver higher education. It has got to be far more intimately involved in the individual at their point of learning, which could be in the workplace, could be in another country, maybe at home, could be anywhere. And that model must be developed pretty quickly. My parting comment would be that if you don't believe that, have a look at a YouTube clip called An Open Letter to Educators. An Open Letter to Educators. It's a YouTube clip which takes 6.5 minutes to watch, but it'll be mind-shifting. Thank you.